Wondering if are we on? No, there we are. And then there was sound on the eighth day. I was wondering if I could just begin with a little question. It really is teeny. Have you ever heard of the phrase, the imagination of expectation? Here's a quick little story of a young person who dared to imagine. And he was a young fellow. He was actually a young engineer. He had graduated from university, and he was about to embark. What he wanted to embark on is that of an engineer. And so he's near the end of a job interview with a human resource officer to this company. And this young engineer applicant, he's fresh out of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And the interviewer asked him, so what kind of a salary are you looking for? What's your expectations there? And this young engineer, he confidently sat up straight and he said, well, I'm looking for something in the neighborhood of about $125,000 a year, depending upon the benefits package. And the interviewer, he just kind of quietly sat back and considered what the young man had suggested, and then he replied, well, how does this sound? What would you say to a package of about 5 weeks vacation, 14 paid holidays, full dental, full medical, company matching retirement fund of 50% of your salary, and a company car leased every 2 years, let's say a red Corvette? And this young guy, this engineer, he sits up straight now and goes, wow, you've got to be kidding. And the interviewer said, yeah, I actually am. But you started it. Hey, you can't really fault this young kid, this young guy for trying, can you? And we don't really know whether he felt entitled to all of that or if he was just trying to test the waters to see what was out there for him. But, in the end, it's a story. That's what it is. And the interviewer may have felt the expectations were a bit absurd. Maybe he even felt that they were even laughable. But sometimes we will hear things that sound absurd, that are nearly laughable, such as a 99-year-old man and a 75-year-old wife parenting a son, having a son together. And we've just heard a story earlier from Michaela of 3 men who had visited Abraham in Genesis 18, and they make this remark to him after they have this little discussion with him that says this in verse 10, I will surely return to you this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son. And when Sarah heard this, if you read on further in the chapter, she overhears all of this. Maybe she's listening, has her ear to the tent door, however that works, and she hears this, and she laughs to herself. I'm reading this, and I know this is true, and I believe it all, and it's still funny to me. And she laughs and says this, after I am worn out, and my Lord is old, Abraham, shall I have pleasure. It is laughable, isn't it? A 99-year-old man and a 75-year-old woman having a son? It kind of goes against the very law of human nature, doesn't it? Against human biology. Like, imagine it for a moment. Mitch, imagine it for a moment. You're young, compared to a 99-year-old guy. Right? Yeah, you want to agree with me on that one. And as we read on in verse 13, the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh? Shall I indeed bear a child now that I'm old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? And this statement really is it. Is anything too hard for the Lord? And you know what? I want to share with you this. There are certain people that I'm really envious of. And I mean it because they can accept this statement, is anything too hard for the Lord? They can accept that statement with very little convincing, with very little persuasion. And when they pray, it's almost as if you can see them entering or sitting within the very throne room of God. And they likely are. And this group of people is kids. Kids who are brought up in the Lord, who are told the stories, who are taught about the living God, and where they are told who God is, and who He is, and that He's over all, and that there is nothing that He cannot do. And where that is instilled within them, that there is nothing too hard for the Lord to do. And kids brought up in the Lord, they don't question what God is capable of. They accept it, and they believe. They have the imagination of faith to believe and to know that all things are possible with God. And the faith that they have, that's what I'm envious of, the imagination of faith. And what's interesting is when you consider the story of Abraham and you carry on in observing him, He was so hospitable to those three guests that were there, like really going out of his way, it seemed like, to make them welcomed. And you know, the custom, ancient Near East customs, that hospitality was a real thing. It was a virtue. And travelers, they would be taken in. They would be cleaned. They would be fed, and they would be given lodging if that was what was necessary. And as we observe Abraham, he seems to sense that there is something extraordinary or something different about these visitors, that they were not ordinary visitors, but that they were messengers from God. And they were. And he was so eager to serve them and to ensure that they were treated well and made to feel welcome and made comfortable. And he was running back and forth to ensure that his guests were treated very well. And here's a few things of interest within the story. Abraham finds these visitors, or these visitors find Abraham among the oaks of Mamre. And now, according to Josephus, he's another ancient historian, he had written that the trees of Mamre were a significant place for Abraham. It was where his family altar was built, and it was the place where he had been circumcised, that ancient Jewish custom of being in covenant with God. It was a special place. And perhaps, and I mean just perhaps, the trees of Mamre were for Abraham his sanctuary, his place of being in the presence of God. And maybe this is somewhat speculative, however, we do find that Abraham is very open to what these guests have to say. And he doesn't laugh at what they have to say either. He doesn't question it. And at no point are we given the impression that Abraham doubted or dismissed this promise as being too absurd or impossible. And why? And we have that statement put before us again. Is anything too hard for the Lord? Is anything too difficult for the Lord? And Abraham rested in this, and he believed this. And I think he could imagine the possibilities of what God could do. And this didn't mean that he would never or could never be surprised by God, because God will always surprise us. But will skepticism take a back seat to the imagination of faith? Are you still able to be surprised by God today? Are you able to sense when he is around you? And are you familiar with the whispering into your soul, into your very spirit? Or does that sort of thing, does that become easy to dismiss as being nothing other than just your own inner longings for something better, a hope, but not a hope that's accompanied with a faith to imagine and to be open to something that may be miraculous, that may be wonderful, and that's something that could happen at any time. In the story of Mark chapter 9, is yet another story of Jesus' miraculous power that sets a young boy free from an unclean spirit. And when reading through the many miracle stories of Jesus throughout the Gospels, there may be a few things that stand out to you. And one thing for me that I notice is that there seemed to only be a handful of people who really demonstrated a bold and unshakable faith. And maybe you can remember some of yourselves, like such as the centurion who had come to Jesus, and he told him that he had this but this servant that he could not bring with him, who was sick and who was ill, and it said, you don't even need to come to my house. You don't even need to come to visit. Just a word, and this servant would be healed, and a long-distance healing. And when Jesus heard this from the centurion, he had said to all who were standing by, I tell you the truth, in all of Israel I have not heard or seen such great faith. And he was astonished. Or maybe you remember from Matthew chapter 15, the story of a Canaanite lady, where she had approached Jesus on behalf of her sick daughter, who was also oppressed by a demon. And Jesus' response to her, if you read through that, it almost seems harsh even. And he says to her that he was sent to the lost sheep of Israel, not to the dogs of humanity, referring to her status as a Gentile. But nothing could discourage this Canaanite lady, and she persists and wins Jesus over. And then Jesus says to her, woman, you have great faith. And Jesus seemed impressed that these foreigners were the least likely people to demonstrate great faith. And why should a Roman centurion or a Canaanite lady who had no Jewish roots put their trust in a Messiah whose countrymen had trouble accepting? And when I look into my own heart, I shake my head at myself all too often because I can identify with the man in Mark chapter 9 who was the father of the son who had that unclean spirit. I can identify readily that with that wavering man who declared to Jesus these words, I do believe. Help me to overcome my unbelief. And would it not seem that the people who knew Jesus best sometimes really faltered in their faith? And the disciples, for example, they seem to walk this line between belief and unbelief an awful lot. And remember, it was Judas. He was with Jesus for 3 years. 3 years where he had watched Jesus work miracles and where he had listened to him teach and preach, and yet he still betrayed Jesus. And then there was another disciple, Thomas, who gained the reputation as a skeptic. But in truth, all of the disciples showed a lack of faith. And none of them believed the wild reports of the ladies when they came back from an empty tomb to say that Jesus had risen. None of them believed those reports. And even after Jesus had appeared to them in person, still there were some who doubted. And doesn't it seem that faith appears where least expected, and it falters where you would think it should thrive? And I wonder how often the Apostle Paul found this to be true during his missionary journeys, going to and fro different places. In our reading from Colossians, it's a powerful excerpt from his writings to them. And it leaves me with little wonder as to why Paul, or how Paul, would have ruffled so many feathers within the Roman Empire, particularly to authorities, as much as he did. Very strong language that he uses, and he uses it so often. In just a few verses again from chapter 1 that Michaela had read, he is, meaning Jesus, he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together, and he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on heaven or whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. Now, just to add a little context to these words, it's helpful to have in mind how Paul begins his letter in verse 1 to the Colossians. To the saints and brothers in Christ at Colossae, grace and peace to you from God our Father. And Paul addresses them as in Christ. And this identity, I think, is crucial because it's above race, it's above ethnicity, it's above social class, it's above nationality. And what does it mean to radically live out the Christian identity where we are at? Well, here's what it meant for Paul's audience living within the ancient Roman Empire. In an imperial mythology where the emperor or Caesar is nothing less than a son of God simply by virtue of his lineage, Paul says that Christ is the firstborn of all creation. And in a culture which Caesar's preeminence is embedded or legitimized and defended by socio-economic, political, and military structures and powers, Paul has the audacity to proclaim not only that all things in heaven and on earth were created through him and for him, but specifically that all thrones, that all dominions, and all rulers are subject to his rule, and that Christ is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And I think that this dismantling, this demythologizing of the Roman Empire and its rulers, it couldn't be clearer here in Colossians. If Jesus is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation, then Caesar is not. And if Jesus is Lord, then the throne of Caesar and all of his power to restore and keep order in the land, it's all subject to the beloved Son, to whom this little community in Colossae had pledged allegiance to. Christ is the head of the body. Christ is the head of the church. It's not Rome, and it's not Caesar. And all of this was achieved on the cross. And peace was made through the blood of the cross. And it is into such a kingdom that we have been invited in Jesus. And Paul calls Colossae to faithfulness, and then declares just how far-reaching this kingdom is. The reconciliation of all things extends to all things under earth and under heaven, all of creation. And it is to this kingdom that those who declare allegiance to belong and are subjects within. And nothing on earth can change that. And that truth extends to all. And wherever we find ourselves, whatever situation is before us, we can know and be so confident that God is sovereign and He is over all and that He will sustain and carry us through. He'll even pull us through whatever it is that makes us feel that our situation is so insurmountable. We can have all faith and we can imagine all things in faith because nothing is too difficult for thee. Nothing is too hard for the Lord. But Mark 9, "O Lord, I believe this. Help me overcome my unbelief." Author Philip Yancey had shared a story of a time of when he had lived in Chicago and he was attending an inner city church, a downtown inner city church. And the church was going through somewhat of a crisis. And so in response to this crisis and how to deal with this crisis, they had suggested, why don't we hold an all-night prayer vigil? And several people raised the question as to whether that would be a good idea or not. And someone said, well, should we hire guards or escorts to meet people in the parking lot when they arrive? What if no one shows up? And I guess it was quite a neighborhood where this church was located. But they decided to go ahead with the prayer vigil. And what was surprising was who had shown up. The poorest members of the congregation, a group of senior citizens from a housing project. They show up, and they're the ones who had responded most enthusiastically to this prayer vigil. And one had to wonder what they had seen through their years amidst living in such crime and poverty and suffering, yet they showed a childlike trust in the power of prayer. And they were asked, well, how long do you want to stay here tonight? An hour or two? And one had said, we'll stay all night. And then a lady in her 90s, in her 90s like Abraham, barely able to see, walked with a cane, explained why she wanted to stay all night. And regardless of how unsafe the neighborhood was, this is what she said. She said, there's lots of things we can't do in this church. We ain't so educated, and we ain't got as much money as some of you younger folks, or as much energy as some of your younger folks, but we can pray. And we got time, and we got faith. Some of us don't sleep much anyway. We can pray all night if needs be. And so they did. And meanwhile, a bunch of middle to upper class members in a church, in a downtown little church, learned anew a lesson of faith from the gospel being displayed before their very eyes. Faith appears where least expected and falters where it should be thriving. Can you be surprised? Can you be surprised by God today? Well, only if you have the faith to imagine the limitless possibilities of what our God can and will do today. And that faith it's only as strong as what we are willing to put into it. Abraham spent time among the trees of Mamre, and 3 visitors come by with this outrageous promise of a son that is going to be born to him at 99 and his 75-year-old bride. But I think that Abraham was familiar with God. He was familiar enough with God. And it wasn't because of the trees of Mamre. That may have been his quiet place, but it was the discipline, his pursuit of the holy, to be with God, to seek solitude and be still before Him, where he could learn and become familiar with the whispers, with the voice of the one true God who cared enough to know His name. And so it will be for you. And so it will be for me. And then we read this, that the steadfast mercies of the Lord, that they are new every morning. New every morning. Do they fascinate you, the mercies of the Lord? Or do they pass by each morning as being familiar, maybe routine? Or do we even notice them at all? Are you still able to be surprised by the Lord today? Or the concerns of your life? Are you still praying through them? Or have you lost hope? Well, please know this then. The prophet Jeremiah speaks these words, and they're words that are probably familiar to many of you here. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope. Then you will call upon me and come and pray to me, and I will hear you. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. When we seek God with all our heart in the day-to-dayness of our lives, we will find him. And we will constantly be filled with wonder that nothing is too hard for the Lord. Nothing is too difficult for our God, for our Redeemer. And the steadfast love of the Lord, it never ceases. And his mercies, they never do come to an end. And they are new every morning. And we can say, great is your faithfulness, O God. Your amazing love, your amazing grace is all about love. And the chains that hold us back, they're broken and we are free. And in response to all that we have sung together and declared together and read together, I'm going to invite Stephen and Jenny, if they would come and sing Amazing Grace, My Chains Are Gone. And if you know this song, just remain seated where you are. If you know the song, feel free to sing with them.